Settle into stillness, dear sleepy friend, and allow the echoes of marching footsteps and quiet determination to fill the silence of the night. Tonight, we journey softly through a story stitched with sashes and protests, petitions and perseverance, a tale of voices long denied, rising steadily into a chorus that would reshape the world. This is the entire story of the suffrage movement, told not in shouts but in calm remembrance. From the first whispers of equality to the moment the ballot was finally cast, we will wander gently through time, through parades of white dresses and candlelit vigils, until dreams bloom with freedom beneath closed eyes. Before we step into this historic night walk, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to join our cozy corner of history each week. Also, leave a comment below. Where are you listening from tonight? It warms our hearts to see sleepy minds tuning in from all over the world. On a particularly warm Tuesday afternoon in July of 1848, Mary Ann McClintock was washing the dishes in her modest farmhouse kitchen when her neighbor Jane Hunt arrived unexpectedly. The two women had known each other for years, their farms sitting barely a mile apart on the dusty roads outside Seneca Falls, New York. Jane brought with her Martha Wright, who was the sister of Lucretia Mott, and the three women settled into the comfortable routine of afternoon tea, a ritual that had sustained countless women through the endless cycles of farm work, childbirth, and the quiet desperation of lives that seemed predetermined by their gender. The conversation that afternoon began, as these gatherings always did, with discussions of their children, the price of flour at the general store, and the latest gossip about who might be courting whom in their small community. But as the tea steeped and the summer light filtered through the gauze curtains, the talk turned to something that had been bothering each of them privately for months. They had all attended the recent anti-slavery convention in nearby Rochester, where they had been forced to sit behind a screen separated from the male delegates. Despite their equal commitment to the abolitionist cause, Lucretia Mott, when she had visited the area earlier that summer, had shared her experiences from the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London 8 years earlier, where the female delegates had been denied their seats simply because they were women. The memory of this insult had festered in each of their minds, growing from a personal slight into a recognition of a fundamental injustice that permeated every aspect of their daily lives. As they sat in McClintock's kitchen, each woman began sharing stories of limitations they had encountered, not from any lack of ability or intelligence, but purely because of an accident of birth that had made them female. Martha Wright, whose husband was a lawyer, spoke of the legal disabilities that faced married women in New York State. When she had married, everything she owned had automatically become her husband's property, including the inheritance she had received from her father's estate. She could not sign contracts, sue or be sued in court, or even claim guardianship of her own children should her husband die. The law treated her as an infant, incapable of managing her own affairs, regardless of her actual competence or intelligence. Jane Hunt, whose family ran a successful farm, described how she had been unable to purchase land in her own name when they had decided to expand their property. The seller had insisted on dealing only with her husband, despite the fact that Jane had managed the family finances for years and had personally saved the money for the purchase. Even though she knew more about crop rotation and soil management than her husband, her opinions on agricultural matters were dismissed by the male farmers who gathered at the Grange Hall each month. Mary Ann McClintock, who had been raised in a Quaker family that valued education for both boys and girls, spoke of her frustration at being denied the opportunity to attend the local academy when she was young, despite her academic abilities. Her brother had received a full education, while she had been limited to basic reading and arithmetic, deemed sufficient for a girl who would presumably spend her life maintaining a household and raising children. Even now, as she managed the complex accounts of their farm and had taught all 5 of her children to read and write, she was not considered qualified to serve on the local school board. As the afternoon wore on and more tea was brewed, the conversation grew increasingly animated. These were not women who were content to accept their lot quietly. Each had been raised in the Quaker tradition, which emphasized the spiritual equality of all people and had already begun to challenge some social conventions. They had all been active in the abolitionist movement, understanding that the principle of human equality extended beyond race to encompass gender as well. But understanding something intellectually and experiencing it personally were 2 different matters entirely. The discussion turned to what might be done about their situation. They knew of other women who felt similarly frustrated, women who met regularly for sewing circles and school committee meetings, who managed businesses and farms while being denied basic legal rights. The idea began to form that perhaps they should organize a public meeting to discuss these issues, not just among themselves but with the broader community. It was a radical thought, for women of their time and place rarely spoke in public, and certainly never about matters of politics or law. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's name came up in the conversation. She was a young mother who had recently moved to Seneca Falls with her husband Henry, a lawyer who had been elected to the New York State Assembly. Elizabeth had been educated at the Troy Female Seminary and was known for her sharp intellect and willingness to speak her mind, even on controversial subjects. The women decided to visit her that very evening, to gauge her interest in helping organize such a meeting. When they arrived at the Stanton home, they found Elizabeth in the midst of the evening chaos that characterized life with 3 young children. The house showed the evidence of her struggle to maintain order, while her husband was frequently away in Albany for legislative sessions. Elizabeth's face lit up when she saw her visitors, grateful for adult conversation and a brief respite from childcare duties. As the women settled into her parlor, the conversation quickly turned to their afternoon discussion and the proposal they had been formulating. Elizabeth listened intently as they explained their idea for a public convention to discuss women's rights. She was immediately enthusiastic, her mind already racing ahead to the practical details such an event would require. Unlike the other women who had approached the idea cautiously, Elizabeth embraced it wholeheartedly. She understood, perhaps better than any of them, the legal ramifications of their grievances, having often discussed these matters with her husband and observed the legislative process firsthand during visits to Albany. The group spent the evening in excited planning, their voices carrying through the open windows into the summer night. They decided that such a convention should be held quickly, before fear or social pressure could dissuade them from their purpose. The Declaration of Independence, with its powerful assertion that all men are created equal, provided a perfect template for their own declaration of sentiments. They would adapt its language to assert that all men and women are created equal, listing their grievances against the tyranny of male dominance, just as the colonists had listed their grievances against King George. The logistics of organizing such an event in barely a week's time were daunting. They needed to secure a venue, draft a declaration, arrange for speakers, and most importantly, publicize the meeting to ensure attendance. The Wesleyan Methodist Church in Seneca Falls had recently been built and might be available for their use. They would need to place advertisements in local newspapers and post handbills throughout the community. The declaration would require careful crafting to ensure it was both forceful and respectable, as they knew their critics would seize upon any perceived impropriety to dismiss their concerns. As the women finally departed into the warm July night, each felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. They were embarking on something unprecedented, something that would likely expose them to ridicule and criticism from their neighbors and even their families. Yet they also felt a sense of liberation, as if the mere act of planning this convention had already begun to chip away at the invisible barriers that had constrained their lives. The Tea Party that had started as a simple social gathering had transformed into the catalyst for what would become the most significant movement for women's rights in American history. The next morning, as Mary Ann McClintock washed the breakfast dishes, she found herself humming with nervous energy. Her husband Richard, noticing her unusual restlessness, asked if something was troubling her. She paused in her work, drying her hands on her apron, and tried to explain what had transpired the previous afternoon and evening. Richard listened with a mixture of concern and confusion, struggling to understand why his competent, intelligent wife would want to involve herself in public agitation for rights she seemed to manage perfectly well without. His reaction, she realized, would be typical of the men they would need to convince if their movement was to succeed. Yet even his skepticism could not dampen her conviction that they were embarking on something necessary and important, something that would resonate far beyond their small community in upstate New York. The morning of July 19, 1848, dawned hot and humid, the kind of summer day that made the simple act of walking to town feel like wading through warm water. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been awake since before sunrise, her mind racing through the details of what they had set in motion. In the parlor of her home, the dining table was covered with sheets of paper, ink stains, and the crumpled remains of multiple drafts. The Declaration of Sentiments, their carefully crafted document outlining women's grievances, lay before her in what she hoped was its final form. The language they had chosen was deliberate and familiar, mirroring the Declaration of Independence that every schoolchild could recite. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal," it began, immediately establishing their claim to the same rights and privileges that men enjoyed. The document went on to list 18 specific grievances, each one carefully worded to reflect the legal and social disabilities faced by women in American society. The right to vote, which would become the most controversial point, was included almost as an afterthought, placed 16th in their list of demands. As Elizabeth dressed her 3 young boys and prepared breakfast, her husband Henry watched her with a mixture of pride and concern. He had returned from Albany the previous evening to find his wife and their friends in the midst of what he considered a well-intentioned but ultimately futile endeavor. Like most men of his generation, Henry believed in gradual change and feared that such radical action might actually harm the cause of women's advancement. Yet he also recognized the determination in Elizabeth's eyes and knew better than to try to dissuade her from what she had set her mind to accomplish. By 9 o'clock, the streets of Seneca Falls began to fill with people. The Wesleyan Methodist Church, a simple wooden structure with plain glass windows and hard pine pews, stood ready to receive what the organizers hoped would be a respectable crowd. They had placed notices in the Seneca County Courier and the Waterloo Sentinel, advertising a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of woman. The wording had been carefully chosen to sound reasonable and measured, avoiding any language that might be construed as inflammatory or revolutionary. The first to arrive were the women who had helped organize the event. Martha Wright came with her sister Lucretia Mott, who had traveled from Philadelphia specifically for this meeting. Mott, at 55, was already well known in abolitionist circles and brought with her an air of quiet authority. Her Quaker dress and gentle demeanor masked a sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to justice. Mary Ann McClintock arrived with her husband Richard and their eldest daughter Mary Ann Jr., who at 21 was already showing signs of inheriting her mother's activism. As the church began to fill, the organizers were surprised and somewhat alarmed to see that nearly half the attendees were men. They had expected perhaps a few sympathetic husbands and fathers, but instead found themselves addressing a mixed audience that included local merchants, farmers, and even several clergymen. Some had come out of curiosity, others from genuine interest, and a few, it would later become clear, to disrupt proceedings they considered improper and dangerous. Frederick Douglass, the former slave turned abolitionist leader and newspaper editor, arrived early and took a seat near the front. His presence was particularly significant, as he was one of the few black men in attendance, and brought with him the moral authority of someone who had personally experienced the denial of human rights. Douglas had been traveling through upstate New York on a speaking tour and had seen the advertisement for the convention. His newspaper, the North Star, had been publishing articles about women's rights for several months, and he was eager to see this new movement take shape. The convention began promptly at 11 o'clock, with Lucretia Mott rising to address the assembly. Her voice, though soft, carried clearly through the church as she explained the purpose of their gathering. She spoke of the long history of women's oppression, tracing it back to ancient times when might had made right and physical strength had determined social hierarchy. But she also spoke of progress, of how civilization had advanced beyond the law of the jungle, and how it was now time to recognize that intellectual and moral capabilities, not physical strength, should determine one's place in society. Elizabeth Cady Stanton then read the Declaration of Sentiments in its entirety. As her voice filled the church, reading words that challenged the very foundations of American society, you could have heard a pin drop. The audacity of claiming that women were equal to men, that they deserved the same rights and privileges, was almost too much for some in the audience to bear. When she reached the section demanding the right to vote, an audible gasp rippled through the crowd. Even some of the women shifted uncomfortably in their seats, wondering if they had gone too far. The discussion that followed was both heated and enlightening. The first to speak in opposition was a local minister who declared that women were naturally subordinate to men, citing biblical passages that seemed to support this view. But his arguments were immediately challenged by other clergymen who pointed out that these same passages had once been used to justify slavery, a practice now almost universally condemned. The debate revealed deep divisions within American Christianity itself, with some denominations already beginning to question traditional interpretations of Scripture. A merchant from Waterloo stood to object to the economic implications of women's rights. If women could own property and enter into contracts, he argued, it would disrupt the entire economic order. Married couples would be able to conduct separate business, potentially doubling the competition for male merchants. How could a man be held responsible for his wife's debts if she had legal independence? How would inheritance work if women could own property independently of their husbands? But the most powerful objections came from the women themselves, or rather from those women who had come to the convention out of curiosity but found themselves frightened by the implications of what they were hearing. Mrs. Sarah P. Hall, the wife of a prominent local physician, stood to declare that she was perfectly happy with her position in society. She had no desire to vote, she said, and found fulfillment in managing her household and raising her children. Why, she asked tearfully, would these women want to disrupt the natural order that had served society well for centuries? Elizabeth Cady Stanton responded to these objections with a combination of intellectual rigor and personal experience. She spoke of her own education, which had been superior to that of many men, yet she was denied the opportunity to use her knowledge in any public capacity. She described the frustration of watching incompetent men hold positions of authority, while competent women were relegated to domestic duties. But she also acknowledged the fears of women like Mrs. Hall, recognizing that change was frightening and that many women had found ways to exert influence within their limited spheres. The debate raged throughout the afternoon, with speakers rising to support or oppose various aspects of the Declaration. When it came time to vote on the individual grievances, the results were mixed. The right to equal education passed easily, as did the right for married women to own property. But the demand for suffrage proved more divisive. The vote was tied until Frederick Douglass rose to speak in support, arguing that denying women the right to vote was no different from denying it to black men. His eloquence swayed the assembly, and the resolution passed by a narrow margin. By late afternoon, the church was stifling hot, and tempers were beginning to fray. The organizers had hoped to conclude by 4 o'clock, but the discussions showed no signs of winding down. Children were becoming restless, and several people had slipped out to check on their farms or businesses. Yet for those who remained, there was a sense that they were participating in something historic, something that would be remembered long after the heat of this July afternoon had faded. As the convention finally drew to a close, the attendees voted to reconvene the following day to continue their discussions and to allow those who had been unable to attend the first day to participate. They also agreed to publish their proceedings and to send copies to other women's groups throughout the country. The Seneca Falls Convention, as it would come to be known, had lasted only one day, but its impact would reverberate for decades. In the days that followed, the local newspapers reported on the convention with a mixture of amusement and alarm. The Seneca County Courier called it the most shocking and unnatural incident ever recorded in the history of humanity, while the North Star praised it as a grand movement for the emancipation of woman from the tyranny of custom and traditional prejudice. Mixed reactions only confirmed what the organizers had suspected. They had started something that could not be easily dismissed or ignored. Yet even as they celebrated their success, the women who had organized the convention knew that they had only taken the first step on what would be a long and difficult journey. The declaration they had signed was merely words on paper until they could find a way to transform those words into reality. The real work, they understood, was just beginning. The weeks following the Seneca Falls Convention brought a level of notoriety that none of the organizers had fully anticipated. Elizabeth Cady Stanton found herself the subject of whispers wherever she went in town. Women who had previously greeted her warmly now crossed the street to avoid conversation, while men who had doffed their hats respectfully now stared openly, as if trying to determine what kind of woman would involve herself in such radical activities. Even her husband Henry, despite his legal training and generally progressive views, found himself defending his wife's actions to colleagues who questioned his ability to control his household. The ridicule was not limited to personal interactions. Newspapers across the country picked up the story of the Women's Rights Convention, as they termed it, with varying degrees of scorn. The New York Herald published a satirical piece suggesting that the convention's next demand would be for women to wear beards and trousers, while religious publications warned that such activities threatened the very foundations of Christian society. The criticism stung, particularly when it came from unexpected sources. Even William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, while supportive of women's participation in the abolitionist movement, editorialized that the timing was wrong for such demands, suggesting that the fight against slavery must take precedence over all other reforms. Yet for every critic, there emerged a surprising defender. Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, one of the most influential newspapers in the country, published a thoughtful editorial acknowledging the justice of women's claims while questioning the wisdom of demanding suffrage immediately. Greeley argued that education and property rights should come first, with voting rights following naturally as society adjusted to women's expanded roles. This measured response gave the movement a legitimacy it might otherwise have lacked, introducing the concept of women's rights to thousands of readers who had never considered the question. The ripples spread outward from Seneca Falls like waves from a stone dropped in water. Within months, similar conventions were being organized in other communities throughout the Northeast. A follow-up meeting in Rochester, held just 2 weeks after Seneca Falls, attracted an even larger crowd and passed similar resolutions. The format established at Seneca Falls became the template for these gatherings, a declaration of principles, a list of grievances, and organized discussion of specific reforms. The movement was finding its voice and learning how to make its case to a skeptical public. But perhaps the most significant development was happening quietly in homes and parlors across the country, as women who had read about the conventions began discussing these ideas with their husbands, their daughters, and their neighbors. The concept that women might deserve equal rights once planted proved difficult to dislodge. Even women who disagreed with the specifics found themselves questioning assumptions they had never before examined. Why couldn't women own property? Why shouldn't they have access to higher education? What was the philosophical basis for denying them the vote? The transformation was particularly noticeable in younger women. Mary Ann McClintock's daughter, who had attended the convention at 21, began speaking to women's groups throughout central New York about the importance of education and economic independence. She started a small school in her mother's home, teaching not only the basics of reading and writing, but also arithmetic, geography, and history to girls whose education had been neglected. Her classes included discussions of current events and the principles of Republican government, topics previously considered unsuitable for female minds. The legal changes that followed were gradual but significant. In 1848, the same year as the convention, New York State passed the Married Women's Property Act, granting married women control over property they brought into marriage or acquired afterward. While the law had been under consideration before the convention, the publicity surrounding the women's rights movement undoubtedly helped secure its passage. Other states began considering similar legislation, and within a decade, 14 states had passed some form of married women's property law. The principle that a woman's property should remain her own, even in marriage, was becoming established in American law. The educational landscape was also shifting. Oberlin College, which had been coeducational since its founding in 1835, saw its female enrollment increase significantly in the years following the convention. More importantly, other institutions began following suit. The University of Iowa became the first public university to admit women on an equal basis with men in 1855, and within 2 decades, most state universities had adopted similar policies. The argument that women's minds were unsuited to higher education was increasingly difficult to maintain as more women demonstrated academic excellence in previously male-dominated fields. The suffrage movement, however, remained the most controversial aspect of women's rights advocacy. The demand for voting rights had barely passed at Seneca Falls and continued to divide even supporters of other reforms. Many women and most men believed that extending the franchise to women was premature, potentially dangerous, and certainly impractical. The cultural assumption that women's place was in the home, caring for children, and managing domestic affairs remained deeply entrenched. Political participation was seen as inherently masculine, involving as it did the rough and tumble of public debate and the capacity for logical analysis that many believed women inherently lacked. Yet even here, progress was being made, though it came in unexpected ways. The very controversy surrounding women's suffrage forced Americans to examine the philosophical foundations of their democracy. If government derived its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, as the Declaration of Independence claimed, then how could half the population be denied any say in that government? The question was particularly acute in the Western Territories, where the harsh realities of frontier life often made traditional gender roles impractical. Women who could manage farms, defend their property, and participate in community decision-making found it difficult to accept that they should have no voice in territorial governance. The movement also began to attract women whose names would become legendary in the fight for suffrage. Susan B. Anthony, a teacher from Rochester, attended her first women's rights convention in 1852 and quickly became one of its most effective organizers. Unlike the married women who had initiated the movement, Anthony had no domestic responsibilities and could devote herself fully to the cause. Her skill as a speaker and organizer helped transform what had been a scattered collection of local efforts into a coordinated national movement. Lucy Stone, another early recruit, became famous for keeping her maiden name after marriage, arguing that a woman's identity should not be subsumed into her husband's. The connection between women's rights and abolition remained strong throughout the 1850s, but it also created tensions within both movements. Some abolitionist leaders, while personally sympathetic to women's rights, feared that association with such a controversial cause might harm the anti-slavery effort. Others argued that the principles underlying both movements were identical and that they should support each other. Frederick Douglass continued to speak forcefully for women's rights, arguing that true equality could not be partial. His newspaper regularly covered women's rights conventions and published letters from women activists. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 transformed the women's rights movement in ways no one could have anticipated. The convention, organized by the same group of women in 1861, was their last before the war interrupted their activities as attention turned to the national crisis. Many women, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, threw themselves into war work, organizing relief efforts and advocating for abolition. The war years demonstrated women's capacity for organization and leadership on a national scale, as they managed the United States Sanitary Commission and other relief organizations that coordinated aid to soldiers and their families. When the war ended and the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, women's rights activists hoped that their support for the Union cause would be rewarded with consideration of their own claims. The proposal for a 14th Amendment that would guarantee equal protection to all citizens seemed to offer an opportunity to advance women's rights simultaneously with the rights of freed slaves. But when the amendment was drafted to include the word male in its definition of citizens, women's rights activists found themselves in the painful position of opposing an expansion of rights for others because it explicitly excluded them. This setback led to a split in the movement that would not heal for decades. Some activists, led by Lucy Stone, accepted that this was not their moment and continued to work for women's rights within the existing political framework. Others, including Stanton and Anthony, became increasingly radical, arguing that women should not support any expansion of male suffrage that did not include them. The controversy revealed deep divisions over strategy and philosophy that would complicate suffrage efforts for years to come. Yet even these setbacks could not extinguish the movement that had begun in that farmhouse kitchen in 1848. The ideas first articulated at Seneca Falls continued to spread, evolving and adapting to new circumstances. The question was no longer whether women deserved equal rights, but when and how those rights would be achieved. The tedious work of organizing, petitioning, and lobbying that would occupy the next 70 years of suffrage activism had its intellectual foundation in the Declaration drafted around that kitchen table, looking back from the perspective of the early 20th century. When the 19th Amendment finally granted women the right to vote, the significance of the Seneca Falls Convention becomes clear. Those 2 days in July 1840 had established the framework for a movement that would transform American society. The women who gathered in that plain wooden church had done more than complain about their grievances. They had articulated a vision of equality that would inspire generations of activists. Their Tea Party conversation had indeed changed history, though not in ways they could have imagined as they sat discussing their frustrations over dishes of cake and cups of tea. The most remarkable aspect of their achievement was its demonstration that profound social change could begin with the most ordinary of actions. These were not professional revolutionaries or political operatives, but housewives and mothers who had simply grown tired of accepting limitations that made no sense. Their story remains a testament to the power of conversation, community, and the courage to speak uncomfortable truths. In our own time, as we continue to grapple with questions of equality and justice, their example reminds us that movements for change often begin not with grand gestures, but with neighbors gathering to share their concerns over afternoon tea. In the winter of 1846, Susan B. Anthony was 26 years old and already showing signs of the stubborn persistence that would define her life's work. She stood before the school board in Canajoharie, New York, a small village along the Mohawk River, trying to explain why she deserved the same salary as the male teachers in her district. The room was overheated, filled with the smell of wet wool and pipe tobacco, as 6 men in heavy coats listened with varying degrees of patience to this young woman's unprecedented demand. Anthony had been teaching in the Canajoharie Academy for 2 years, and her performance evaluations were exemplary. Her students consistently scored higher on examinations than those of her male colleagues, and parents specifically requested that their children be placed in her classes. Yet, she was paid 1/4 the salary of the male teachers, even those with less experience and education. When she had first raised the question with the school board the previous spring, they had explained patiently that men needed higher salaries because they had families to support, while women presumably did not. The circular logic had escaped them entirely. This winter meeting was her third attempt to secure equal pay, and she had come prepared with arguments that went beyond her personal situation. She presented data showing that female teachers in New York State were generally better educated than their male counterparts, as teaching was one of the few professions open to educated women. She cited examples of male teachers who had been dismissed for incompetence, yet had received multiple times her salary. Most importantly, she argued that the quality of education provided to children should not depend on the gender of their teacher, and that compensating teachers based on anything other than merit was fundamentally unfair. The school board's response was predictable. They thanked her for her service, praised her dedication to her students, and explained that their hands were tied by budgets and tradition. The chairman, a local merchant named Josiah Williams, suggested that if she found the conditions unsatisfactory, she might consider marriage, which would relieve her of the necessity of employment altogether. The other board members nodded sagely, as if this kindly meant advice solved every problem. Anthony had raised what the school board could not have known was that this meeting would prove a pivotal moment, not just for Susan B. Anthony, but for the entire women's rights movement. Anthony left the meeting with a sense of clarity that had been building for months. She had tried to work within the system to prove through excellence that women deserved equal treatment. She had succeeded in every measurable way, yet still found herself treated as an inferior. The experience crystallized her understanding that individual achievement, no matter how impressive, could not overcome systemic discrimination. The Anthony family had long been involved in reform movements. Susan's father, Daniel Anthony, was a Quaker who had been active in the temperance movement and had hosted anti-slavery meetings in their home. Her mother, Lucy Reed Anthony, had raised 7 children while managing the family farm and had quietly instilled in her daughters a sense of their own capabilities. The family had been supporters of the Seneca Falls Convention 2 years earlier, though Susan herself had been unable to attend due to her teaching responsibilities. Like many women of her background, she had followed the events with interest, but had not yet seen how they connected to her own life. The experience with the school board changed that. Anthony began devoting her spare time to reading about women's legal status, studying property law, and corresponding with other reformers. She discovered that her situation as a teacher was merely one example of how the law systematically disadvantaged women. In New York, married women could not own property, make contracts, or claim custody of their children. Single women like herself had slightly more legal standing, but still faced numerous restrictions on their economic and social participation. In 1849, Anthony accepted an invitation to speak at a temperance convention in Albany. The experience proved eye-opening in ways she had not anticipated. The male delegates welcomed her participation in discussions about the evils of alcohol, but grew uncomfortable when she began connecting temperance to women's rights. Many argued that women's moral influence should be exerted through their husbands and sons rather than through direct political action. When Anthony suggested that women needed the vote to protect their homes from the influence of alcohol, she was told that such matters were too complex for female minds. These experiences were building towards something, though Anthony was not yet certain what form it would take. She continued teaching as she needed the income, but her heart was no longer in it. The classroom that had once seemed like a place where she could make a difference now felt like a cage, limiting her ability to effect broader change. She began searching for ways to devote herself full-time to reform work, knowing that such a decision would mean giving up the financial security she had worked to achieve. The winter of 1850 brought a series of events that would shape the rest of Anthony's life. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had organized the Seneca Falls Convention and was becoming increasingly prominent in women's rights circles, was scheduled to speak in nearby Syracuse. Anthony attended the lecture out of curiosity, but found herself deeply moved by Stanton's analysis of women's legal disabilities and her call for organized action. After the lecture, the two women were introduced and immediately recognized in each other a kindred spirit and complementary set of skills. Stanton was brilliant, but struggled with the practical aspects of organizing. She had young children and a husband whose political career required her to maintain a certain level of domestic respectability. Anthony, unmarried and financially independent, had the freedom to travel and organize that Stanton lacked. More importantly, Anthony possessed the methodical patience and attention to detail that Stanton sometimes lacked. Where Stanton could inspire with grand visions, Anthony could translate those visions into practical action. Their first collaboration came in 1851, when they organized a women's rights convention in Syracuse. Anthony threw herself into the work with a dedication that surprised even herself. She spent weeks traveling through central New York, visiting every village and town to publicize the event. She spoke at churches, schools, and private homes, adapting her message to different audiences. With Quaker families, she emphasized the spiritual equality of all souls. With working-class women, she focused on economic justice and fair wages. With educated women, she discussed legal disabilities and political rights. The Syracuse Convention was a success, attracting over 1,000 attendees and generating significant press coverage. More importantly, it established a pattern that Anthony would follow for the next 50 years. She would travel, speak, organize, and petition, building a network of supporters that stretched across the country. She kept meticulous records of every contact, every pledge of support, every volunteer who might help with future efforts. Her organizational skills transformed what had been scattered local efforts into a coordinated movement. Anthony's approach to organizing was methodical and persistent. She understood that changing laws required changing minds first, and changing minds required patient education and personal connection. She would arrive in a town several days before a scheduled lecture and begin visiting influential residents, explaining the cause and seeking endorsements. She cultivated relationships with newspaper editors, trying to ensure fair coverage or at least minimize hostility. She trained local women to continue the work after she left, establishing committees and preparing petitions for circulation. These early organizing efforts quickly revealed the enormous scope of the challenge. The vast majority of American women, particularly those outside reform circles, had never considered the possibility that their situation might be unjust. They accepted their legal disabilities as natural and proper, often arguing that women were spiritually superior to men and should not sully themselves with worldly concerns like politics and business. Many were genuinely shocked by Anthony's arguments, having never encountered such ideas before. The petition campaigns that would become Anthony's trademark began during these early years. She realized that personal testimony, collected systematically and presented to legislators, could be a powerful tool for demonstrating the need for reform. Her first major campaign focused on married women's property rights in New York State. She spent months traveling the state, collecting signatures from women who explained how the lack of property rights had affected their lives. The stories she gathered were heartbreaking. Widows left penniless despite their husbands' estates, mothers unable to protect their children's inheritance from spendthrift husbands, women forced to watch their families suffer because they could not control their own earnings. The petition drive was grueling work. Anthony would arrive in a town with no advance notice, find lodging with a sympathetic family, and begin the laborious process of collecting signatures. She had to overcome not only indifference but active hostility. Some women refused to sign, fearing their husband's anger. Others agreed privately but would not put their names to paper. Men often interrupted her appeals, arguing that women were naturally inferior, or that existing arrangements served everyone well enough. Yet Anthony persisted, developing the techniques that would serve her throughout her life. She learned to frame her arguments in terms that resonated with her audience. When speaking to farmers' wives, she discussed how property law affected family farms. When addressing urban women, she focused on wage-earning opportunities and economic independence. She always carried copies of relevant laws and could cite specific examples of how they worked against women's interests. Her thorough preparation and patient explanation gradually won converts. The New York State Legislature's response to the property rights petition was characteristic. The petitions were received and referred to committee, where they languished for months before being politely rejected. Legislators expressed sympathy for individual hardships but argued that existing law protected families adequately. They suggested that women who were unhappy with their situation should choose their husbands more carefully, as if legal disabilities were merely the result of poor marital choices. This response taught Anthony a crucial lesson about the nature of political change. Legislators, even sympathetic ones, were unlikely to support radical reforms unless they felt sustained pressure from their constituents. The occasional petition, no matter how well documented, could be safely ignored. Only continuous organized pressure would force politicians to take women's claims seriously. This realization shaped the rest of her career, as she devoted herself to building institutions that could maintain that pressure year after year. By 1854, Anthony had abandoned teaching entirely and was supporting herself through paid lecturing and organizing work. This decision required considerable courage, as it meant giving up the economic security she had worked to achieve. She lived simply, staying with supporters when traveling and maintaining only modest lodgings when she had a base. Her entire existence was devoted to the movement, with every waking hour spent either organizing, speaking, or planning future activities. She had become, in essence, the first professional women's rights organizer in American history. The years just before the Civil War saw Anthony's organizing efforts reach new levels of sophistication. She developed systems for maintaining contact with supporters across multiple states, creating networks that could respond quickly to legislative opportunities or threats. She learned to work with state legislators, identifying sympathetic members and tracking the progress of relevant bills. She established relationships with newspaper editors and journalists, cultivating favorable coverage and responding to criticism. Most importantly, she began training other women to take on organizing roles, recognizing that the movement could not depend on her alone. Anthony's collaboration with Elizabeth Cady Stanton deepened during these years. Stanton, confined more by domestic responsibilities, focused on writing and strategy, while Anthony handled the practical organizing. Together, they produced countless pamphlets, speeches, and petition campaigns. Stanton's theoretical depth complemented Anthony's practical skills perfectly. When Stanton developed the argument that women needed the vote to protect their interests in marriage and motherhood, Anthony translated this into petition campaigns that gathered thousands of signatures from mothers concerned about their children's welfare. The petition work became increasingly sophisticated. Anthony developed standardized forms that could be adapted to different states and issues. She trained volunteer organizers to gather signatures systematically, ensuring that each petition represented a cross-section of the community rather than just reform circles. She learned to time submissions to coincide with legislative sessions when members would be most receptive. She documented every signature, maintaining files that could be used to build support for future efforts. By 1860, when the Civil War interrupted most reform activities, Anthony had established herself as the organizing genius of the women's rights movement. She had created the infrastructure that would sustain the movement through decades of struggle. Her petition campaigns had become a recognized part of the political landscape, forcing legislators to at least acknowledge women's claims. More importantly, she had demonstrated that persistent, organized action could achieve results, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. The war years tested this infrastructure severely. Many women's rights activists, like their male counterparts, turned their attention to the national crisis. Anthony herself devoted considerable time to organizing relief efforts and supporting the Union cause, but she never abandoned her commitment to women's rights, using every opportunity to connect the war for union and freedom with the ongoing struggle for women's equality. When she organized women to collect supplies for soldiers, she also educated them about their own political disabilities. When she spoke at war relief meetings, she drew parallels between the slavery being abolished and the legal subjection of women. The war's end brought new challenges and opportunities. The proposed 14th Amendment, with its guarantee of equal protection for all citizens, seemed to offer hope for women's rights. But when the amendment was drafted to specifically include the word male, Anthony found herself in the agonizing position of opposing an expansion of rights because it explicitly excluded women. The controversy revealed how deeply entrenched gender discrimination had become in American law and how difficult it would be to achieve full equality. Yet Anthony's organizing skills proved invaluable during this difficult period. When the movement split over whether to support the 14th and 15th Amendments, she worked to maintain communication between the factions. Her petition campaigns continued, focusing on state-level reforms that could be achieved even while the suffrage question remained unresolved. She understood that each small victory built momentum for larger changes, and that maintaining the movement's vitality was crucial for eventual success. As the 19th century entered its final decades, Anthony's methods became the standard for reform movements of all kinds. Her systematic approach to petition gathering, her careful cultivation of political relationships, her patient education of public opinion, these techniques would be adopted by temperance advocates, labor organizers, and countless other reformers. She had demonstrated that social change required more than passionate speeches or compelling arguments. It demanded the tedious work of building organizations, training volunteers, maintaining records, and persisting through years of apparent failure. The petitions that Anthony spent her life collecting were more than political documents. They were tangible evidence of thousands of individual acts of courage as women dared to claim rights their society denied them. Each signature represented someone willing to risk social disapproval for the sake of justice. The methods she developed for gathering and presenting these petitions became the foundation for modern political organizing. When you sign an online petition today or receive a call from a political volunteer, you are participating in a tradition that Susan B. Anthony helped establish. The transformation from that young teacher demanding equal pay to the organizer who could coordinate petition drives across multiple states did not happen overnight. It required decades of patient work, countless disappointments, and the stubborn refusal to accept that tedious work was less important than dramatic gestures. Anthony understood that changing the world meant showing up, day after day, to do the unglamorous work of democracy. Her legacy is not just in the specific reforms she helped achieve, but in demonstrating how ordinary citizens could organize to challenge entrenched power. The decade following the Civil War represented the most challenging period of Susan B. Anthony's organizing career. The women's rights movement, which had begun with such hope and momentum, was fracturing under the weight of competing priorities and philosophical differences. The debate over the 14th and 15th Amendments had split longtime allies, with some arguing that women should support any expansion of democracy, while others insisted that accepting anything less than full equality was a betrayal of principle. Anthony found herself in the painful position of trying to maintain unity, while also advancing what she believed was the only morally defensible position. The practical difficulties of sustaining a national movement became apparent immediately. The war had disrupted networks that had taken years to build. Many of the women who had served as local organizers were now dealing with the aftermath of the conflict, rebuilding farms, mourning lost family members, or simply exhausted by years of war work. Financial support for the movement evaporated as attention turned to reconstruction and veterans issues. Anthony herself was nearly 50 years old and showing signs of the wear that constant traveling and speaking had inflicted on her health. Yet it was precisely during these difficult years that Anthony's organizational genius became most apparent. While others debated philosophy and strategy, she focused on the practical work of keeping the movement alive. She understood that the split over the Reconstruction amendments did not eliminate the need for continued organizing around women's rights. State legislatures were still considering married women's property laws, educational opportunities for women were still expanding, and even the suffrage question was not entirely dead. New territories being settled in the West provided opportunities to write more equitable laws from the beginning. Anthony's response was to create new institutions that could operate independently of the philosophical disputes dividing the movement. In 1868, she and Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded The Revolution, a weekly newspaper dedicated to women's rights. The paper served multiple functions. It provided a platform for discussing women's issues, it maintained communication among scattered supporters, and it generated income to support Anthony's organizing work. More importantly, it kept the movement visible during a period when many assumed that women's rights activism had been subsumed into the larger Reconstruction effort. The newspaper's influence extended far beyond its relatively modest circulation of 3,000 to 5,000 readers. Anthony used it to develop and test arguments that would later appear in her speeches and petition campaigns. She published letters from women across the country describing how legal discrimination affected their daily lives, creating a record of grievances that would inform future advocacy. The paper also covered the movement's activities in detail, ensuring that local efforts received national attention and that successful strategies could be replicated elsewhere. Anthony's petition campaigns became increasingly sophisticated during this period. She developed what we would now call a database of supporters, maintaining detailed records of who had signed previous petitions, who might be willing to circulate them, and which legislators were most receptive to women's rights arguments. She learned to coordinate timing across multiple states, ensuring that petitions arrived in legislative offices simultaneously from different quarters, creating an impression of widespread support that was difficult to ignore. She perfected the art of matching petition language to specific legislative proposals, making it clear exactly what changes were being requested. The 1870s saw Anthony's organizing efforts expand into new areas. The settlement of the West provided opportunities to influence territorial governments before they achieved statehood. Anthony spent months traveling through Kansas, Colorado, and other territories, organizing women's rights associations and encouraging settlers to include equal rights provisions in their territorial constitutions. She understood that achieving suffrage in even a few states would create precedents that would be difficult for other states to ignore permanently. Her petition campaigns in these territories were carefully coordinated with local leaders who could continue the work after she moved on. Perhaps the most innovative aspect of Anthony's work during this period was her development of what would now be called grassroots organizing. She no longer limited herself to speaking at established reform meetings or women's groups. Instead, she began organizing in factories, rural communities, and immigrant neighborhoods. She learned to speak to audiences who had never before considered women's rights, adapting her message to address their specific concerns. When addressing Irish immigrant women, she discussed how voting rights would help them protect their families from anti-Catholic discrimination. When speaking to factory workers, she connected women's suffrage to labor rights and fair wages. The petition campaigns also became more targeted and strategic. Rather than simply gathering signatures on general appeals for women's rights, Anthony began organizing campaigns around specific pieces of legislation. When California was considering a new constitution in 1878, she coordinated a massive petition drive that collected over 10,000 signatures supporting equal rights provisions. The campaign was carefully timed to coincide with the Constitutional Convention, and Anthony personally traveled to California to present the petitions and lobby delegates. While the final Constitution did not include full suffrage for women, it did contain some equal rights provisions that would have been unthinkable 20 years earlier. Anthony's methods for gathering signatures became increasingly systematic. She developed standardized forms that could be quickly reproduced and distributed. She trained volunteer organizers to approach potential signers respectfully and to address common objections with specific facts and examples. She learned to identify the most effective locations for signature gathering, churches, markets, and local events where people gathered naturally. Most importantly, she began following up on petitions, ensuring that signers were contacted when relevant legislation was being considered and that they understood the importance of maintaining pressure on their representatives. The decade following the Civil War represented the most challenging period of Susan B. Anthony's organizing career. The women's rights movement, which had begun with such hope and momentum, was fracturing under the weight of competing priorities and philosophical differences. The debate over the 14th and 15th Amendments had split longtime allies, with some arguing that women should support any expansion of democracy, while others insisted that accepting anything less than full equality was a betrayal of principle. Anthony found herself in the painful position of trying to maintain unity, while also advancing what she believed was the only morally defensible position. The practical difficulties of sustaining a national movement became apparent immediately. The war had disrupted networks that had taken years to build. Many of the women who had served as local organizers were now dealing with the aftermath of the conflict, rebuilding farms, mourning lost family members, or simply exhausted by years of war work. Financial support for the movement evaporated as attention turned to reconstruction and veterans issues. Anthony herself was nearly 50 years old and showing signs of the wear that constant traveling and speaking had inflicted on her health. Yet it was precisely during these difficult years that Anthony's organizational genius became most apparent. While others debated philosophy and strategy, she focused on the practical work of keeping the movement alive. She understood that the split over the Reconstruction amendments did not eliminate the need for continued organizing around women's rights. State legislatures were still considering married women's property laws, educational opportunities for women were still expanding, and even the suffrage question was not entirely dead. New territories being settled in the West provided opportunities to write more equitable laws from the beginning. Anthony's response was to create new institutions that could operate independently of the philosophical disputes dividing the movement. In 1868, she and Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded The Revolution, a weekly newspaper dedicated to women's rights. The paper served multiple functions. It provided a platform for discussing women's issues, it maintained communication among scattered supporters, and it generated income to support Anthony's organizing work. More importantly, it kept the movement visible during a period when many assumed that women's rights activism had been subsumed into the larger Reconstruction effort. The newspaper's influence extended far beyond its relatively modest circulation of 3,000 to 5,000 readers. Anthony used it to develop and test arguments that would later appear in her speeches and petition campaigns. She published letters from women across the country describing how legal discrimination affected their daily lives, creating a record of grievances that would inform future advocacy. The paper also covered the movement's activities in detail, ensuring that local efforts received national attention and that successful strategies could be replicated elsewhere. Anthony's petition campaigns became increasingly sophisticated during this period. She developed what we would now call a database of supporters, maintaining detailed records of who had signed previous petitions, who might be willing to circulate them, and which legislators were most receptive to women's rights arguments. She learned to coordinate timing across multiple states, ensuring that petitions arrived in legislative offices simultaneously from different quarters, creating an impression of widespread support that was difficult to ignore. She perfected the art of matching petition language to specific legislative proposals, making it clear exactly what changes were being requested. The 1870s saw Anthony's organizing efforts expand into new areas. The settlement of the West provided opportunities to influence territorial governments before they achieved statehood. Anthony spent months traveling through Kansas, Colorado, and other territories, organizing women's rights associations and encouraging settlers to include equal rights provisions in their territorial constitutions. She understood that achieving suffrage in even a few states would create precedents that would be difficult for other states to ignore permanently. Her petition campaigns in these territories were carefully coordinated with local leaders who could continue the work after she moved on. Perhaps the most innovative aspect of Anthony's work during this period was her development of what would now be called grassroots organizing. She no longer limited herself to speaking at established reform meetings or women's groups. Instead, she began organizing in factories, rural communities, and immigrant neighborhoods. She learned to speak to audiences who had never before considered women's rights, adapting her message to address their specific concerns. When addressing Irish immigrant women, she discussed how voting rights would help them protect their families from anti-Catholic discrimination. When speaking to factory workers, she connected women's suffrage to labor rights and fair wages. The petition campaigns also became more targeted and strategic. Rather than simply gathering signatures on general appeals for women's rights, Anthony began organizing campaigns around specific pieces of legislation. When California was considering a new constitution in 1878, she coordinated a massive petition drive that collected over 10,000 signatures supporting equal rights provisions. The campaign was carefully timed to coincide with the Constitutional Convention, and Anthony personally traveled to California to present the petitions and lobby delegates. While the final constitution did not include full suffrage for women, it did contain some equal rights provisions that would have been unthinkable 20 years earlier. Anthony's methods for gathering signatures became increasingly systematic. She developed standardized forms that could be quickly reproduced and distributed. She trained volunteer organizers to approach potential signers respectfully and to address common objections with specific facts and examples. She learned to identify the most effective locations for signature gathering: churches, markets, and local events where people gathered naturally. Most importantly, she began following up on petitions, ensuring that signers were contacted when relevant legislation was being considered and that they understood the importance of maintaining pressure on their representatives. The 1880s brought new challenges as Anthony approached her 60th birthday. The physical demands of constant traveling were becoming more difficult to manage. She suffered from back problems that made long train journeys excruciating, and her eyesight was beginning to fail, making it harder to read the endless stream of correspondence that her work generated. Yet these physical limitations seemed only to sharpen her focus and determination. She became more selective about where she traveled, but more intensive in her organizing efforts when she did visit a community. During this decade, Anthony's petition campaigns achieved their first major legislative victories. Several Western states, pressured by coordinated petition drives and lobbying efforts, passed laws granting women full or partial suffrage. The Wyoming Territory had led the way in 1869, but now Colorado, Utah, and Idaho followed suit. Each victory required years of patient organizing, and each provided new evidence that women's suffrage did not bring the social chaos that opponents predicted. Anthony made sure that these successes were carefully documented and publicized, using them to counter arguments that women did not want the vote or that society would collapse if they got it. The petition work also became more professionalized. Anthony began hiring full-time organizers who could maintain a presence in key states, even when she was elsewhere. She established an office in New York City where correspondence could be handled efficiently and where records of supporters and their interests could be maintained. She developed relationships with printers who could produce high-quality petition forms at reasonable cost, and she learned to coordinate with other reform organizations to avoid competing for the same supporters, attention, and resources. Perhaps the most significant development of this period was Anthony's recognition that petition campaigns needed to be accompanied by systematic efforts to change public opinion. She began organizing lecture tours that would visit a community several times over the course of a year, building support gradually rather than making one-time appearances. She recruited young women to become professional lecturers, training them to speak effectively and to handle hostile audiences. These women would give dozens of lectures in each community, slowly shifting public opinion until petition campaigns could succeed. By the 1890s, Anthony had been organizing for women's rights for over 40 years. The movement she had helped build was now a national force with thousands of active supporters and a presence in every state. Yet suffrage for women remained elusive, achieved only in a few Western states and repeatedly rejected at the federal level. The petition campaigns that had once seemed like a path to quick victory had become a way of life, a means of keeping the issue visible while building support for eventual success. The physical toll of decades of organizing was increasingly apparent. Anthony's hair had turned white, and her face showed the lines of countless nights spent traveling on uncomfortable trains and sleeping in unfamiliar beds. Her hearing had deteriorated to the point that she had difficulty following conversations in crowded rooms, yet her energy and determination seemed undiminished. She continued to travel, to speak, to organize petition drives with the same methodical dedication she had shown as a young woman. The petition campaigns themselves had evolved significantly. What had begun as simple appeals for basic rights had become sophisticated political operations. Anthony's organizers now targeted specific legislative committees and tracked the voting records of individual legislators. They learned to time petition deliveries to coincide with key moments in the legislative process. They built coalitions with other groups whose interests aligned with women's rights, particularly labor organizations and progressive reform groups. The turn of the century brought new urgency to the suffrage campaign. The Spanish-American War had demonstrated women's contributions to national welfare beyond their traditional domestic roles. The progressive era was bringing new attention to social problems and expanding the role of government in addressing them. Women were increasingly educated and active in their communities. All of these developments seemed to suggest that the time for women's suffrage had finally arrived. Anthony's final major petition campaign came in 1902-1903, when she coordinated a massive effort to pressure Congress for a federal suffrage amendment. The campaign gathered over 400,000 signatures, an extraordinary achievement for a time when organizing required physical travel and face-to-face contact. The petitions were bound in massive volumes and formally presented to Congress, creating a spectacle that attracted national attention. While the amendment was not passed during Anthony's lifetime, the campaign demonstrated the breadth of support for suffrage and the organizational capacity of the movement she had built. The machinery that Anthony had spent 50 years constructing was now capable of operating without her direct supervision. State suffrage associations had been established across the country, staffed by women who had learned organizing techniques through working with Anthony. Professional lobbyists maintained regular contact with legislators. The petition campaigns that had once required Anthony's personal attention were now coordinated by full-time staff. The movement had become self-sustaining, no longer dependent on the tireless efforts of one extraordinary woman. Looking back over Anthony's career from the perspective of 1906, when she died at the age of 86, the magnitude of her achievement becomes clear. Through 5 decades of patient organizing, she had built a movement from a handful of committed reformers to a national force that could no longer be ignored. The petition campaigns that had seemed like small, futile gestures had accumulated into an irresistible demand for change. The signatures she gathered, the meetings she organized, the lectures she delivered, all of these had created the foundation for the final push that would achieve women's suffrage 14 years after her death. The techniques Anthony developed for gathering and presenting petitions became standard practice for every subsequent social movement. Her understanding that social change required patient, systematic organizing influenced generations of activists. Her demonstration that ordinary citizens could challenge entrenched power through persistent, non-violent action provided a model that would be adopted by labor organizers, civil rights activists, and countless other reformers. When women finally achieved the vote in 1920, they were building on foundations that Susan B. Anthony had laid through 50 years of tedious, unglamorous, absolutely essential work. The final years of Susan B. Anthony's life were marked by both triumph and frustration. The women's suffrage movement she had spent 5 decades building had become a powerful national force. State after state was falling to the suffrage column, particularly in the West, where Anthony had focused much of her organizing energy. Washington state granted women full voting rights in 1910, California followed in 1911, and by 1914 women could vote in 11 Western states. The petition campaigns that Anthony had perfected were now gathering hundreds of thousands of signatures, and suffrage amendments were being seriously debated in Congress for the first time in decades. Yet Anthony herself was increasingly isolated from the day-to-day work she had once dominated. Now in her 80s, her health failing and her hearing almost gone, she could no longer travel extensively or endure the exhausting schedule that had characterized her earlier years. She continued to speak when possible, but her appearances were limited to major events where accommodations could be made for her disabilities. The movement she had created was moving forward without her, carried by younger women who had learned their organizing skills working alongside her but now operated independently. The irony was not lost on Anthony that victory appeared to be approaching just as she was, becoming too frail to participate fully in the final push. The petition campaigns that had once required her personal supervision were now coordinated by professional staff working from modern offices equipped with telephones and typewriters. The travel that had once meant uncomfortable train journeys and uncertain accommodations was now handled by women who could afford hotels and Pullman cars. The audiences that had once been hostile or indifferent were now often sympathetic, particularly in areas where women were already voting and the predicted social chaos had failed to materialize. Despite her physical limitations, Anthony remained intellectually engaged with the movement's strategy and direction. She maintained correspondence with leaders across the country, offering advice based on decades of experience and occasionally intervening in disputes that threatened unity. Her Rochester home became a gathering place for suffrage workers, and she continued to receive delegations seeking her counsel. Even when she could no longer travel to Washington for lobbying efforts, her name and reputation lent authority to the ongoing campaign for a federal amendment. The petition drive of 1993 that gathered over 400,000 signatures represented both a culmination of Anthony's techniques and a demonstration of how the movement had outgrown her personal supervision. The campaign was organized by a national committee that coordinated activities across 48 states. Professional organizers oversaw signature gathering, while trained volunteers handled the tedious work of verifying and recording names. The petitions themselves were works of craftsmanship, printed on high-quality paper and bound in leather volumes that created an impressive visual when presented to Congress. Anthony's final public appearance came in February 1906, just weeks before her death, when she attended the National American Woman Suffrage Association convention in Baltimore. Despite her frailty, she insisted on addressing the delegates, speaking for what would be the last time to the movement she had helped create. Her voice, weakened by age and illness, still carried the passion and determination that had characterized her entire career. She reviewed the progress that had been made during her lifetime, from the tiny gathering at Seneca Falls to the national movement that now commanded respect and attention. Yet, she also acknowledged how much remained to be done, reminding her audience that the struggle for equality extended far beyond the ballot box. The response to her final speech was overwhelming. Delegates wept openly as the woman who had symbolized women's rights for over half a century bade them farewell. The press coverage was respectful and even affectionate, a marked change from the ridicule and hostility that had greeted her early efforts. Even publications that opposed women's suffrage acknowledged Anthony's personal integrity and dedication. The transformation in public opinion that she had worked so tirelessly to achieve was evident in the very tone of the coverage. When Anthony died on March 13, 1906, The reaction confirmed how completely she and her cause had been integrated into American public life. Newspapers across the country carried lengthy obituaries that reviewed her career with surprising fairness. Even the New York Times, which had consistently opposed women's suffrage, acknowledged that, however much one may differ with Miss Anthony's views, no one can question her sincerity or fail to recognize her extraordinary ability as an organizer and leader. The memorial services were attended by prominent political figures who would never have appeared at women's rights meetings during her early career. The immediate aftermath of Anthony's death demonstrated how thoroughly she had institutionalized the movement. The organizations she had built continued to function smoothly, and the petition campaign she had perfected rolled forward without missing a beat. Within months of her passing, new campaigns were underway in several states, employing the techniques she had developed. The trained organizers she had mentored were now leading their own efforts, passing on her methods to a new generation of activists. Yet there was also a sense that the movement had lost something irreplaceable. Anthony's unique combination of organizational skill, personal integrity, and stubborn persistence had held the movement together through decades when success seemed impossible. She had been willing to do the tedious work that others found discouraging, to travel to remote communities that more glamorous speakers ignored, to maintain relationships with supporters over decades when progress seemed non-existent. Her successor generation, while competent and dedicated, lacked her unparalleled credibility and the moral authority that came from having sacrificed everything for the cause. The years following Anthony's death saw the final push toward women's suffrage accelerate dramatically. The techniques she had perfected, petition campaigns coordinated across multiple states, systematic lobbying of legislators, careful cultivation of public opinion through lecture tours and newspaper coverage were employed with increasing sophistication. State after state fell to the suffrage column, particularly in the West, where Anthony had concentrated much of her organizing energy. The federal amendment that had seemed hopelessly idealistic during her lifetime gradually became a realistic possibility. The culmination came in 1920, 14 years after Anthony's death, when the 19th Amendment finally granted women the right to vote throughout the United States. The ratification campaign employed every technique Anthony had developed during her 50 years of organizing. Petitions containing millions of signatures were gathered and presented to Congress. Professional lobbyists maintained constant pressure on legislators. State-by-state campaigns used the networks Anthony had helped build, adapted for a new era of communication and transportation. The final victory was in every sense a product of the machinery Anthony had constructed. The long delay between Anthony's death and final victory illustrates both the magnitude of the challenge she had undertaken and the effectiveness of her patient, systematic approach. The 50 years she spent organizing represented only the first phase of a struggle that would extend over 70 years in total. Yet without her tireless work building the movement's foundation, the final victory might have taken even longer, or might not have been achieved at all. The petition campaigns that seemed so futile during her lifetime had gradually shifted public opinion until what had once been radical became acceptable and finally inevitable. The legacy of Anthony's organizing work extends far beyond the achievement of women's suffrage. The techniques she developed became standard practice for every subsequent social movement. Her demonstration that systematic patient organizing could challenge entrenched power influenced generations of activists. The understanding that social change required not just compelling arguments, but also the tedious work of building organizations, training leaders, and maintaining pressure over decades became fundamental to reform efforts of all kinds. Perhaps most importantly, Anthony's career illustrates how individual dedication can translate into institutional change. The petitions she gathered, stretching from that first property rights campaign in the 1850s to the massive federal amendment drive of 1902-1903, represented millions of individual acts of courage by women who dared to claim rights their society denied them. Each signature was a small gesture of defiance that, when combined with thousands of others, became irresistible. The machinery Anthony built transformed these individual acts into collective power, demonstrating how democracy could be made to serve those it had originally excluded. The victory that came too late for Anthony to celebrate personally was in every sense her victory. The techniques, organizations, and networks she had spent 50 years constructing were the instruments that finally achieved women's suffrage. The understanding that social change required patient, systematic work had been proven correct, even if the patience required extended beyond a single lifetime. Her petition campaigns, which had once seemed like drops of water wearing away a stone, had indeed eroded the foundations of political inequality until they finally collapsed. In our own time, when social movements often seek instant gratification through viral campaigns or dramatic gestures, Anthony's example offers a different model of change. Her willingness to devote an entire lifetime to work that might not bear fruit for decades demonstrates the kind of commitment that fundamental social transformation requires. The petitions that filled boxes and file cabinets, the meetings held in drafty halls, the speeches delivered to hostile audiences, all of these tedious activities accumulated into the foundations of modern American democracy. The next time you sign a petition or volunteer for a cause you believe in, you are participating in a tradition that Susan B. Anthony established through 50 years of patient, determined, absolutely essential work. On January 10, 1917, the morning air in Washington, D.C. was sharp with winter cold as 12 women walked toward the White House gates carrying banners that would soon become famous across America. They were dressed respectably in the long skirts and sensible coats that marked them as middle-class matrons rather than dangerous radicals. Their signs, painted in purple, white, and gold, the colors of the National Woman's Party, bore simple but provocative messages. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? And Kaiser Wilson, take the beam out of your own eye. The women positioned themselves along the iron fence surrounding the White House and stood silently, holding their banners aloft as commuters, government workers, and tourists passed by. The timing of this protest was no accident. Woodrow Wilson had just been inaugurated for his second term, having campaigned on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," while privately preparing for American entry into World War I. The National Woman's Party, led by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, had decided that polite lobbying and patient petition gathering were no longer sufficient. The war had created a crisis that demanded dramatic action. How could Wilson lead a crusade to make the world safe for democracy while half of his own citizens were denied the fundamental right of democratic participation? The idea of picketing the White House was revolutionary, not just politically, but socially. Respectable women did not stand in public holding protest signs. They did not draw attention to themselves or challenge male authority in such a direct, visual way. The concept of women engaging in public protest at all was still novel enough to attract attention, but doing so at the seat of presidential power seemed almost sacrilegious. The White House, after all, was not just the president's home, but a symbol of American democracy itself. Standing outside it with banners demanding change was a form of visual confrontation that most Americans had never witnessed. The first day of picketing proceeded without incident. The women arrived at 10 in the morning and stood in shifts throughout the day, their silent presence attracting curious stares and occasional supportive nods. The White House gates remained closed, but guards occasionally glanced in their direction, uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented form of protest. Passers-by read the signs, some stopping to ask questions or engage in discussion. A few hecklers shouted insults, but the women's silence and dignified appearance seemed to discourage more aggressive responses. Alice Paul, the strategist behind the protest, had chosen the participants carefully. They were not the young radicals who had recently joined the suffrage movement, but established, respectable women whose presence would be difficult to dismiss as the actions of wild-eyed fanatics. Among them were Dora Lewis, a Philadelphia social worker, Lavinia Dock, a nurse and author, and Matilda Hall Gardner, a Washington socialite whose family connections included senators and Supreme Court justices. Their appearance and bearing challenged stereotypes about suffrage activists, while their messages directly confronted Wilson's hypocrisy. The decision to picket had been made after months of frustration with traditional lobbying methods. Despite the suffrage movement's half-century of organized effort, only a handful of states had granted women full voting rights. The federal amendment that Susan B. Anthony had worked for throughout her life remained stalled in Congress, blocked by a coalition of conservative legislators who saw no political advantage in supporting women's rights. The National Woman's Party, formed in 1916 specifically to take more militant action, believed that the time for polite requests had passed. The war provided both opportunity and urgency. Wilson's rhetoric about fighting for democracy overseas while ignoring democratic deficits at home created an opening for pointed criticism. The massive mobilization of women for war work demonstrated their capacity for public service and patriotic contribution. Women were working in factories, serving as nurses, managing farms and businesses, and organizing relief efforts. Their exclusion from political participation seemed increasingly anomalous as their contributions to the war effort became essential. The picketing strategy also reflected changing tactics within the women's rights movement. The patient, educational approach, favored by Susan B. Anthony and her generation, was giving way to more confrontational methods borrowed from the British suffrage movement. Alice Paul had participated in militant actions in England, including hunger strikes and window-smashing campaigns, and believed that similar tactics were necessary in America. The Silent Sentinels, as the White House picketers came to be known, represented a distinctly American form of militancy, legal, non-violent, but impossible to ignore. The daily routine of picketing quickly established itself. The women arrived each morning and stood in shifts throughout the day, regardless of weather. They rotated positions to avoid fatigue and maintain fresh faces for photographers. Their silence was deliberate, contrasting sharply with the boisterous demonstrations common to labor protests and political rallies. This quiet dignity made their presence more unsettling, as there was nothing to arrest or condemn beyond the simple fact of their existence and their challenging messages. The banners themselves were carefully crafted for maximum impact. The Kaiser Wilson sign particularly enraged patriotic Americans who saw any comparison between their president and the German autocrat as treasonous. Other signs quoted Wilson's own words about democracy and self-determination, making it difficult for administration supporters to defend his position without appearing hypocritical. The purple, white, and gold color scheme created visual unity, while the simple, direct language ensured that even casual observers understood the protest's message. As the days turned into weeks, the picketing became a Washington institution. Tourists made special trips to see the Silent Sentinels, while government workers adjusted their commute routes to avoid or observe the daily demonstrations. The press began covering the protests regularly, and photographs of the picketers appeared in newspapers across the country. The very ordinariness of the women's appearance, their respectable clothes, their calm demeanor, their middle-class respectability made their defiance more remarkable and difficult to dismiss. The Wilson administration's initial response was to ignore the protests entirely. The president made no public mention of the picketers, and administration spokesmen refused to discuss the demonstrations with reporters. This studied indifference reflected both uncertainty about how to respond and confidence that the protests would quickly fade away. Previous women's rights demonstrations had been short-lived affairs that generated temporary publicity before evaporating. The administration expected the silent pickets to follow the same pattern. But Alice Paul and her colleagues had planned for a long campaign. They had arranged for replacement picketers to ensure continuous coverage, established a support system to provide food and shelter for participants, and created media strategies to maintain public attention. The war might end in months or years, but they were prepared to continue their protest until women achieved the vote or public opinion forced Wilson to address their demands. The Silent Sentinels were not a temporary publicity stunt, but a permanent challenge to presidential authority. The personal stories of the women who participated revealed the careful planning behind the protests. Many were veterans of previous suffrage campaigns who had decided that traditional methods were insufficiently dramatic. Some were professionals whose careers demonstrated women's capabilities for public service. Others were society women whose presence challenged assumptions about who supported radical change. Their diversity undermined attempts to stereotype suffrage activists, while their unity demonstrated the breadth of support for women's rights. As January turned to February, the picketing continued daily, creating an unprecedented visual presence in the nation's capital. The women's persistence was beginning to attract international attention, with coverage appearing in British and European newspapers. The very novelty of American women engaging in such direct political protest made compelling copy, particularly as the United States prepared to enter the war as a champion of democracy. The contrast between Wilson's rhetoric and his domestic policies was becoming impossible to ignore. The Silent Sentinels had succeeded in their initial goal of attracting attention to the suffrage cause, but the real test would be maintaining their protest over months and years. The coming of spring would bring larger crowds and more media attention, but also new challenges from government officials who grew increasingly impatient with their presence. The war would transform American society in ways that made women's contributions impossible to ignore, but would also create an atmosphere where dissent of any kind was viewed with suspicion. The picketers who stood so calmly outside the White House gates that first winter morning were embarking on a journey that would test their dedication and reshape American politics in ways they could not have imagined. The spring of 1917 brought a dramatic escalation to the Silent Sentinels protest. As America entered World War I in April, the picketers' banners became more pointed in their criticism of President Wilson. The simple request, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" was replaced by more direct accusations. "Democracy should begin at home," and "Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed?" 20 million American women are not self-governed. These signs, held daily outside the White House gates, became increasingly intolerable to administration supporters who demanded total unity behind the war effort. The first arrests came on June 22, 1917, when 6 picketers, including Alison Turnbull Hopkins and Catherine Morey, were taken into custody for obstructing traffic. The charge was absurd. Traffic flowed freely around the women, who stood silently along the fence, but it provided police with a pretext to remove them. The women were tried, convicted, and sentenced to pay $3 fines or serve 3 days in jail. They chose jail, establishing a pattern that would be repeated dozens of times over the next 2 years. The simple act of refusing to pay fines transformed the protest from a mere nuisance into a moral statement that attracted national attention. The District of Columbia jail where the women were sent was a Dickensian horror. Built in the 1870s to hold 200 prisoners, it now housed nearly 600 in conditions that violated every contemporary standard of humane treatment. The cells were small, damp, and infested with vermin. Prisoners received inadequate food, a breakfast of cold coffee and stale bread, a lunch of watery soup, and a dinner of more soup and bread. There were no facilities for bathing, and the straw mattresses were changed only monthly. Most appalling to middle-class women accustomed to basic comforts, there were no toilet facilities in the cells, only chamber pots that were emptied once daily. The first group of prisoners, expecting to serve their 3 days in relative comfort, were shocked by these conditions. Alison Hopkins, whose husband was a prominent Baltimore businessman, found herself sharing a cell with common criminals. The guards, uncertain how to treat respectable women, alternated between deference and brutality. The women were denied writing materials, reading matter, and communication with their families. When they complained about conditions, they were told that prisoners had no right to complain. They should have thought of that before breaking the law. The publicity generated by these arrests transformed the picketing campaign. Newspapers that had ignored the silent sentinels now reported extensively on the arrest of respectable women and their imprisonment in deplorable conditions. The contrast between the picketers' dignified appearance and the squalid conditions of their confinement created powerful imagery that challenged public assumptions about both women's rights activists and the criminal justice system. Middle-class Americans who might oppose women's suffrage were appalled by the idea of middle-class women being treated like common criminals. More importantly, the arrests created a new category of suffrage martyr. The women who went to jail became heroes within the movement, their suffering giving moral authority to the cause they served. When Alison Hopkins emerged from jail after 3 days, she was greeted by cheering supporters and extensive press coverage. Her simple statement, "I have been treated like a common criminal for asking for the rights of American citizens," was repeated in newspapers across the country. Other women, inspired by her example, volunteered to take her place at the White House gates. The government's response to the jail sentences revealed its uncertainty about how to handle this unprecedented form of protest. The Wilson administration was trapped between competing pressures. On one side, supporters demanded that the picketers be silenced, particularly as the war effort intensified and dissent of any kind became suspect. On the other side, arresting and imprisoning respectable women created martyrs and generated sympathy for their cause. The administration tried various approaches, ignoring the protests, increasing sentences, improving jail conditions, but nothing succeeded in ending the demonstrations. The situation escalated dramatically in July 1917, when more than 20 picketers were arrested in a single day. Among them was Lucy Burns, who would become one of the movement's most visible martyrs. Burns, educated at Oxford and fluent in multiple languages, was precisely the type of woman that opponents found most threatening. Intelligent, articulate, and absolutely unwilling to compromise her principles. When she refused to pay her fine and was sentenced to 60 days in jail, the government believed it had found a way to break the protest by removing its most effective organizer. Instead, Burns' imprisonment became the catalyst for a hunger strike that would transform the entire nature of the protest. Along with other prisoners, she began refusing food on July 20, 1917. The hunger strike was not initially planned as a protest tactic, but grew out of the prisoners' genuine revulsion at jail conditions. Within days, however, it became a deliberate challenge to governmental authority. If the government claimed the right to imprison women for demanding their rights, the women would demonstrate that government could not force them to cooperate in their own oppression. The hunger strike created a dilemma that the government had never faced. Force-feeding, the standard response to prison hunger strikes, was a brutal procedure that involved inserting tubes through prisoners' noses and down their throats. This process, developed to deal with male criminals, had never been used against middle-class women. The image of respectable American women being strapped to chairs and force-fed through tubes was the kind of public relations disaster that the administration desperately wanted to avoid. Yet allowing prisoners to starve themselves to death was equally unacceptable. The force-feeding began in early August 1917 and created exactly the moral outrage that picketers had hoped for. Prison officials, clearly uncomfortable with their task, administered the procedure with varying degrees of brutality. Some guards seemed to take sadistic pleasure in causing pain, while others performed the task mechanically, avoiding eye contact with their victims. The women, many of whom had never experienced physical violence, found the experience both physically agonizing and psychologically degrading. Dora Lewis, a Philadelphia social worker who had dedicated her life to helping the poor, described being strapped to a chair like a criminal, while a doctor rammed a tube down my throat until I gagged and vomited. The public reaction to force-feeding was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Even newspapers that opposed women's suffrage editorialized against the practice, arguing that treating American women like criminals was unworthy of a democratic society. The image of middle-class women being physically assaulted by government agents created a narrative that the Wilson administration could not control. Photographs of the picketers before their arrests, dignified, well-dressed, entirely respectable, contrasted sharply with descriptions of their treatment in jail. The government's attempts to portray them as dangerous radicals collapsed in the face of their obvious gentility. Perhaps most damaging to the administration was the way these arrests affected the families of the prisoners. Husbands who had been indifferent or even hostile to their wives' activism found themselves defending imprisoned spouses. Fathers who had considered suffrage a harmless hobby became enraged by their daughters' mistreatment. Children who had taken their mother's political activities for granted suddenly understood the courage required to challenge governmental authority. The transformation of private embarrassment into public pride was repeated in household after household as families rallied around their imprisoned relatives. The personal correspondence that survives from this period reveals the complex emotions experienced by the prisoners and their families. Alison Hopkins wrote to her husband from jail describing her loneliness and physical discomfort, but also her absolute conviction that her suffering served a larger purpose.
"I would not exchange my 3 days here for all the comfort in the world," she declared,
"because I know that what we are doing will help every woman in America who comes after us." Similar sentiments appear in letters from other prisoners, suggesting that their jail experiences created a sense of moral purpose that sustained them through difficult times. The escalation of sentences also revealed the desperation of government officials who could not find an effective way to stop the protests. Initial 3-day sentences grew to weeks and then months as judges attempted to deter further demonstrations. Lucy Burns received a 60-day sentence in July 1917, but by November, sentences of 6 months were being handed down routinely. The longest sentence was given to Alice Paul herself, 7 months in the workhouse, for the crime of standing silently outside the White House with a banner. These increasingly harsh punishments had the opposite of their intended effect, convincing more women that the government was acting unjustly and that their cause was morally righteous. The war context made the situation even more complex. The Wilson administration was simultaneously prosecuting the picketers while mobilizing women for war work. Women were being asked to sacrifice economically, to send their sons and husbands to fight, and to maintain the home front in unprecedented ways. Yet those who asked for political rights in return were imprisoned and force-fed. This contradiction became increasingly difficult to defend as the war progressed, and women's contributions became more essential to victory. Even administration supporters began questioning whether imprisoning women for peaceful protest was consistent with democratic values. By the end of 1917, over 200 women had been arrested for picketing, and more than 100 had served jail sentences. The movement had created a steady stream of martyrs whose suffering generated ongoing publicity for their cause. Each arrest, each jail sentence, each instance of force-feeding became another piece of evidence that the government was acting unjustly. The silent sentinels had succeeded in transforming themselves from mere protesters into victims of governmental oppression, and this transformation gave their cause a moral authority that traditional lobbying could never have achieved. The impact of these arrests extended far beyond the suffrage movement itself. The mistreatment of the picketers became a national scandal that challenged American assumptions about their own democracy. If women could be imprisoned and force-fed for peaceful protest, what did that say about American values? If government could act so brutally against middle-class native-born citizens, how could it claim moral superiority over the autocratic regimes it was fighting in Europe? The questions raised by the silent sentinels' imprisonment resonated far beyond the specific issue of women's suffrage, forcing Americans to examine their own commitment to democratic principles. By the spring of 1918, the Silent Sentinels protest had become a fixture of Washington life. For more than a year, women had maintained their daily vigil outside the White House, enduring arrests, imprisonment, and force-feeding. The war was entering its final phase, with American troops now fully engaged in Europe. The picketing continued even as victory seemed increasingly likely, creating an atmosphere of expectation that the peace settlement would somehow include women's political emancipation. The question was no longer whether the protest would end, but how and when it would achieve its ultimate goal. The impact of the picketing on public opinion had been profound and irreversible. What had begun as a curiosity, the sight of respectable women standing silently with protest signs, had become a national symbol of governmental injustice. The arrests and force-feeding had created martyrs whose suffering generated sympathy even among those who opposed women's suffrage on principle. Newspapers that had initially mocked the picketers now editorialized in support of their right to protest peacefully. The government's heavy-handed response had transformed a fringe protest into a mainstream cause. The war's end in November
18 created a political
opening that suffrage leaders had long anticipated. President Wilson, preparing to travel to France for the peace conference, was eager to present the United States as the world's leading democracy. The contradiction between this role and the continued political disenfranchisement of half the American population became increasingly awkward. The silent sentinels had succeeded in making this contradiction visible and embarrassing, and Wilson was sophisticated enough to understand that his international credibility was partly dependent on resolving it. The final push for women's suffrage began in January 1919, when Wilson publicly endorsed the federal suffrage amendment for the first time. His endorsement was cautious and qualified. He supported the amendment as a war measure rather than a matter of fundamental justice, but it represented a critical breakthrough. The president's support gave cover to Democratic legislators who had previously opposed suffrage, while providing additional arguments for Republican supporters. The political calculus that had blocked suffrage for decades was finally shifting. The silent sentinels themselves were not present for Wilson's conversion. The picketing had ended in November 1918 when the government finally stopped arresting protesters, and the women themselves recognized that their point had been made. The 2-year vigil had achieved its purpose of keeping pressure on the administration while generating sympathy for the suffrage cause. The transformation from radical protest tactic to accepted political pressure had been completed, and the movement could now focus on the legislative battle that would determine ultimate victory. The final campaign for the 19th Amendment employed every technique that had been developed over 70 years of suffrage activism. Petition campaigns gathered millions of signatures, coordinated by the national organizations that the silent sentinels had helped strengthen. Lobbying efforts targeted specific legislators whose votes were crucial, using the personal relationships that had been built over years of patient cultivation. Public demonstrations, now accepted as legitimate political activity, attracted thousands of participants and generated extensive media coverage. The amendment's passage through Congress in June 1919 was anticlimactic compared to the drama of the picketing campaign. The final vote was closer than supporters had hoped, but the result was not in doubt once Wilson had committed his administration. The real battle shifted to the state ratification process, where approval by 36 states was required. This battle would continue for 14 months, involving intensive organizing in every state legislature and culminating in the dramatic Tennessee vote that would complete the amendment. The silent sentinels could claim partial credit for the final victory, though their specific contribution was difficult to isolate from the broader movement's efforts. The picketing had succeeded in keeping pressure on the Wilson administration during a crucial period, and the martyrdom created by arrests and imprisonment had generated public sympathy that translated into political support. The 2-year vigil had demonstrated that women were willing to endure significant hardship for their rights, making it difficult for legislators to claim that women did not want the vote. The legacy of the White House picketing extended far beyond the achievement of women's suffrage. The demonstration that respectable women could engage in public protest without losing their dignity or effectiveness established precedents that would be followed by every subsequent social movement. The techniques developed by the silent sentinels, nonviolent resistance, dignified bearing, and patient persistence became standard practice for activists seeking social change. The transformation of public opinion that accompanied their protest showed that even deeply entrenched opposition could be overcome through moral suasion. The personal stories of the picketers revealed the permanent impact of their protest on their own lives. Many continued in political activism after the victory, applying their newfound skills to other causes. Some became leaders in the women's organizations that emerged in the 1920s, while others returned to private life with enhanced confidence in their capacity for public service. The experience of imprisonment and force-feeding had created bonds among them that lasted a lifetime, and their shared sacrifice gave them a special status within the movement they had served. The silent sentinels had proven that even the most powerful government could be challenged through disciplined, nonviolent protest. Their stand outside the White House gates had transformed them from mere citizens into symbols of democratic principle. The 2 years they spent in silent vigil had made visible the contradictions between American ideals and American practice, forcing their fellow citizens to examine their own commitment to equality and justice. The vote they helped achieve was their victory, but the techniques they developed belonged to every subsequent movement for social change. In the summer of 1920, the temperature in Nashville, Tennessee, regularly exceeded 90 degrees, turning the Tennessee state capitol into an oven of political intrigue. The building itself, completed in 1859 in the Greek Revival style, had seen the state vote for secession, endure military occupation during Reconstruction, and weather decades of political corruption. But never in its 60-year history had it witnessed the kind of drama that was about to unfold within its limestone walls. The 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, had passed Congress in June 1919 and been ratified by 35 states. Only one more state was needed to make it part of the Constitution, and Tennessee had the dubious honor of being the last possible hope for ratification before the 1920 presidential election. The political situation in Tennessee was complicated by every possible factor. The governor, Albert H. Roberts, was a Democrat who had won election by the narrowest of margins and faced a hostile legislature controlled by Republicans and conservative Democrats. The state was still largely rural, with powerful interests that opposed women's suffrage on grounds ranging from religious conviction to economic self-interest. The liquor industry, fearing that women voters would support prohibition, had spent heavily to defeat suffrage candidates. Manufacturing interests worried that women would support labor legislation. Traditionalists simply believed that women's place was in the home, not the polling booth. The suffrage movement in Tennessee had been growing for decades, but remained divided along lines that reflected national tensions. The Tennessee Equal Suffrage Association, affiliated with the more conservative National American Woman Suffrage Association, advocated for gradual change through educational campaigns and polite lobbying. The Tennessee branch of the National Woman's Party, heir to the militant tradition of Alice Paul and the Silent Sentinels, demanded immediate action and was willing to use pressure tactics to achieve it. Between these two organizations were dozens of local groups, church societies, and professional associations that supported women's rights but disagreed about methods and timing. The summer of 1920 brought these divisions into sharp focus as national suffrage leaders descended on Nashville. Carrie Chapman Catt, president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, arrived with an entourage of experienced lobbyists and a carefully planned strategy. She had spent decades building the organization that Susan B. Anthony had founded and possessed the political skills that Anthony had lacked. Catt understood that the ratification battle would be won or lost in Tennessee, and she was prepared to devote every resource to ensuring victory. Her presence in Nashville added both gravitas and tension to an already volatile situation. The opposition was equally well organized and financed. The Tennessee Association opposed to women's suffrage included many of the state's most prominent citizens, including former governors, business leaders, and religious figures. They argued that women's suffrage would destroy the family, undermine male authority, and lead to social chaos. Their campaign literature featured alarming predictions of women abandoning their children for political careers, of husbands being forced to cook their own meals while their wives attended political meetings, and of the natural order being overturned by social experimentation. The legislature that convened in August 1920 was one of the most evenly divided in Tennessee history. The House of Representatives had 99 members, with suffrage supporters holding a slim but uncertain majority. The Senate had 33 members, where ratification appeared to have stronger support. But appearances were deceiving, as party loyalty, personal ambition, and local pressure created shifting coalitions that made vote counting impossible. A delegate who had pledged support might change his position overnight, influenced by a letter from a constituent, a visit from a minister, or the promise of a political appointment. The lobbying effort that developed in Nashville was unprecedented in Tennessee political history. The city had never seen such an influx of professional political operatives, all focused on a single vote. Hotels were filled to capacity, restaurants became informal headquarters for competing factions, and the State House corridors were crowded with women who had never before participated in political activity. The scent of perfume mixed with cigar smoke and the sound of female voices debating constitutional law echoed through marble halls that had previously echoed only with male political discourse. Arguments presented to legislators reflected every possible approach to persuasion. Suffrage supporters emphasized women's contributions to the war effort, the unfairness of taxation without representation, and the inconsistency of fighting for democracy abroad while denying it at home. They cited the experience of Western states where women voted without apparent social disruption and quoted President Wilson's endorsement of the federal amendment. They promised that women voters would support good government and moral reform, appealing to legislators' self-interest while maintaining ladylike decorum. The opposition employed equally varied tactics, combining traditional arguments about women's natural subordination with more practical concerns about political power. They warned that women voters would support prohibition, higher taxes, and increased government regulation. They suggested that suffrage was part of a larger radical agenda that included socialism, free love, and the destruction of the American family. They appealed to racial prejudices by suggesting that women's suffrage would increase the political power of African Americans, a particularly potent argument in the segregated South. The personal stories of individual legislators revealed the complexity of the political calculations involved. Representative Harry Byrne, a 24-year-old Republican from McMinn County, had campaigned as a suffrage opponent, but found himself subjected to intense pressure from both sides. His personal situation was typical of many legislators, caught between campaign promises, constituent pressure, personal convictions, and practical political considerations. His district had voted against suffrage in a referendum, but his own mother was an active suffrage supporter. He represented the younger generation of Tennessee politicians who recognized that women's political participation was inevitable. But he also understood that supporting suffrage might end his political career. The role of national political figures added another layer of complexity to the Tennessee battle. President Wilson, despite his public endorsement of the federal amendment, was privately reluctant to interfere in state politics. His administration was preoccupied with the peace treaty and League of Nations fight, and Wilson himself was increasingly incapacitated by illness. Republican leaders, while generally supportive of suffrage, were reluctant to hand Democrats a victory that might influence the 1920 presidential election. The result was that Tennessee legislators were largely left to make their decision based on local considerations rather than national party pressure. The summer wore on with increasing tension as both sides realized that the
outcome was genuinely uncertain.
Each day brought new rumors about vote counts, with supporters and opponents claiming success by margins that changed hourly. The lobbying intensified as the legislative session continued, with women who had never before spoken to politicians learning to master the art of political persuasion. The hotel lobbies and boarding houses of Nashville became informal classrooms in practical politics, as veteran suffrage workers taught newcomers how to identify undecided legislators, how to present arguments effectively, and how to maintain pressure without alienating potential supporters. Harry Byrne sat in his cramped boarding house room on August 18, 1920, rereading the letter that had arrived that morning from his mother. Phoebe Byrne, a widow who ran the family farm in McMinn County, had never been politically active beyond voting in local elections when women gained that right in school board races. Her letter, written in the careful script of someone who had left school at 14 but continued to educate herself through reading, began with the usual maternal concerns about her son's health and diet. But it quickly moved to the question that was dividing Tennessee and the nation. Dear son, hurrah and vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt. The letter continued with arguments that Phoebe had clearly been preparing for weeks, perhaps months. She cited women's contributions to the war effort, the unfairness of taxation without representation, and the inconsistency of fighting for democracy abroad while denying it at home. But most powerfully, she wrote about her own experience as a farm woman who had managed the family property while raising children and maintaining a household. I have raised a family of boys to honorable manhood,
and I think I have a right to
vote, she declared in a sentence that encapsulated the entire suffrage argument in personal terms. The timing of this letter was crucial. Harry Byrne had been elected as an anti-suffrage candidate, partly because he genuinely believed that women's place was in the home, and partly because this position was popular in his rural district. He had voted against ratification in committee and had told constituents that he would continue to do so when the amendment reached the House floor. His political future seemed secure, supporting traditional values in a traditional community while avoiding the controversy that had ended other Tennessee political careers. The ratification vote scheduled for that afternoon would allow him to maintain this position while claiming that he was representing his constituents' wishes. But Harry Byrne was also a careful observer of political trends. At 24, he was part of a generation that had grown up with women's increasing participation in public life. His own mother had managed the family farm since his father's death, making decisions about crops, livestock, and finances that were supposedly beyond women's capabilities. He had seen women organize successful charity drives, manage businesses, and serve effectively on school boards. The argument that women were inherently unfit for political participation was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain, particularly for someone who had witnessed his mother's competence firsthand. The letter from Phoebe Byrne was not an isolated communication, but part of a coordinated effort by suffrage workers to reach undecided legislators through their families. The National American Woman Suffrage Association had realized that persuading legislators directly was often less effective than influencing their wives, mothers, and sisters. Women who had never been involved in politics were writing to male relatives serving in the legislature, using family bonds to overcome political calculations. These letters were often more powerful than professional lobbying because they combined personal affection with moral authority. The campaign to reach legislators' families was remarkably sophisticated. Suffrage workers identified family members who might be sympathetic and provided them with information about the suffrage issue tailored to their specific concerns. Ministers' wives received theological arguments about equality and justice. Farm women got statistics about how suffrage had helped rural communities in western states. Businessmen's wives heard about the economic benefits of women voters who supported stable government and low taxes. The approach was personalized but consistent, creating multiple pressure points that complemented direct lobbying of legislators themselves. Harry Byrne's situation was complicated by the fact that his district had voted against suffrage in a referendum, giving him political cover to oppose ratification. But he also understood that referenda and legislative votes were different matters. The district's opposition reflected general conservatism rather than specific animosity towards suffrage, and he suspected that attitudes were changing rapidly. His mother's letter suggested that even in rural McMinn County, women were organizing and men were reconsidering their positions. The political risks of supporting suffrage might be less serious than they appeared initially. The morning of August 18, 1920, brought other pressures as well. Suffrage supporters had identified Byrne as a possible convert and had been working on him for weeks. They provided him with information about how suffrage had worked in Western states without causing social disruption. They introduced him to women who had contributed to the war effort and were now asking only for political rights in return. They appealed to his ambition by suggesting that supporting suffrage would mark him as a progressive leader rather than a traditional politician. Most effectively, they convinced him that history would judge legislators by their position on this crucial vote. The anti-suffrage forces had also recognized Byrne's importance and had been equally active in maintaining his opposition. They warned him that supporting suffrage would end his political career, pointing to other legislators who had been defeated after changing their positions on controversial issues. They argued that suffrage was part of a larger radical agenda that included socialism, prohibition, and the destruction of traditional family structures. They appealed to his masculine pride by suggesting that real men protected their wives and mothers from the corrupting influence of politics rather than thrusting them into it. But Phoebe Byrne's letter contained an argument that these political considerations could not counter the simple assertion that she, as his mother, deserved his vote. This was not an abstract debate about constitutional principles or political philosophy, but a direct request from the person who had given him life and raised him to manhood. Every son understands the difference between disagreeing with his mother's opinions and disappointing her deeply held desires. Phoebe Byrne was not asking her son to reconsider his political philosophy, but to recognize her as a full citizen of the republic she had helped build through her domestic labor and wartime contributions. The physical letter itself was remarkable for its combination of maternal concern and political argument. Phoebe's handwriting, practiced through years of writing to her sons and managing farm accounts, was clear and forceful. She had clearly thought about her arguments, perhaps discussing them with other women in her community or reading suffrage literature that was circulating widely. The letter's tone was loving but firm. She was advising her son rather than commanding him, but the advice carried the weight of maternal authority that no man could ignore entirely.
Her closing, "Your loving mother who hopes you will do the right thing," left
the decision to Harry, while making clear what she believed the right thing was. The letter's impact was multiplied by the context in which it arrived. Harry Byrne had been wrestling with his decision for weeks, and the letter crystallized conflicts that had been building throughout the legislative session. He had seen how the suffrage campaign had energized women who had never before participated in politics, and he recognized that their energy and dedication were unlikely to disappear, regardless of how the vote turned out. He understood that the tide of history was running towards suffrage, and that opposing it would eventually seem as anachronistic as opposing universal male suffrage seemed to modern Americans. The other letters that Byrne received that morning revealed how thoroughly his situation had changed. Messages from anti-suffrage constituents warned him of political retribution, but seemed increasingly shrill and threatening. Letters from suffrage supporters, including some from his own community, were respectful and optimistic, appealing to his better nature rather than his fears. The contrast between these approaches reflected the different ways that political pressure could be applied, and Byrne seems to have found the positive appeals more persuasive than the negative threat. The legislative context also favored ratification by August 1920. The amendment had been passed by Congress 14 months earlier, and the momentum for ratification was growing rather than diminishing. 35 states had already approved it, including most of the large industrial states and many southern states. The political momentum was clearly on the side of ratification, and Tennessee's rejection would be seen as an attempt to block inevitable change rather than a principled stand for traditional values. Legislators who opposed suffrage were beginning to understand that they were fighting a rearguard action rather than defending a defensible position. Harry Burns' pocket, as he walked to the State House that afternoon, contained not just his mother's letter but dozens of telegrams, letters and messages from constituents, lobbyists and political allies. But it was Phoebe's letter that he would later credit with changing his vote, partly because of its content and partly because of what it represented. His mother's request embodied the entire suffrage argument in personal terms. Women who had contributed to building America deserved a voice in governing it. The abstract arguments about constitutional principles and political philosophy were important, but they could not match the simple justice of his mother's claim. The story of Phoebe Burns' letter has become one of the most famous in American political history because it encapsulates how political change occurs not through abstract arguments but through personal relationships. The suffrage movement succeeded not because it convinced men through philosophical arguments, but because it demonstrated that the women they knew and loved deserved political rights. Phoebe Burn was not unique in writing to her son. Hundreds of other mothers wrote similar letters to their legislator sons, but her timing was perfect, and her son's position was crucial. The letter became famous not because it was extraordinary, but because it was effective. When the Tennessee House of Representatives convened on August 18, 1920, to vote on the 19th Amendment ratification, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation and tension. The galleries were packed with women who had traveled from across the state to witness what everyone present understood would be a historic vote. The suffrage supporters wore yellow roses, the traditional symbol of their movement, while opponents wore red roses. The sight of the chamber, half yellow, half red, provided a visual representation of the division that had paralyzed Tennessee politics for months and would now be resolved by a single roll call vote. The voting began in the early afternoon and proceeded alphabetically through the 99 House members. The initial count showed the amendment failing by a single vote, with the opposition maintaining their two-vote margin from previous attempts. As the roll call continued, suffrage supporters watched in mounting frustration as their numerical disadvantage held firm. The careful counting and recounting done by both sides had been accurate. There were simply not enough votes to achieve ratification. The cause that had united women for 70 years would be defeated by the narrowest of margins in what was literally the last possible state. Harry Burns' name was called near the end of the alphabetical roll. The 24-year-old legislator stood slowly, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted his coat. The chamber fell silent as members recognized the significance of this particular vote. Burn had been elected as an anti-suffrage candidate and had consistently opposed ratification in committee votes. His district had voted against suffrage in a referendum, giving him political cover to maintain his opposition. Many observers assumed he would vote no, providing a margin of defeat that would end Tennessee's role in the suffrage drama. Instead, Burn cast the vote that changed American history. "Aye," he said quietly but firmly, and the chamber erupted in chaos. The suffrage supporters in the gallery cheered and wept, while Red Rose opponents shouted accusations of betrayal. Burn himself sat down quickly, his face pale with the recognition that he had just defied his constituents and endangered his political career. The final count showed 48 votes for ratification, 48 against, with 3 members absent or not voting. Burns' switch had created a tie that would require the Speaker to cast the deciding vote. The Speaker's vote was itself a dramatic moment. Seth Walker, a Nashville attorney who had led the anti-suffrage forces in the House, was placed in an impossible position. As the presiding officer, he had to choose between his personal opposition to suffrage and his institutional responsibility to ensure that the House functioned properly. His vote against ratification was predictable but also provided the final margin that made Tennessee the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. The amendment that had been first proposed in 1878, debated for 42 years, and fought over for generations, was now part of the United States Constitution. The immediate aftermath of the vote revealed both the personal cost and historical significance of what had occurred. Harry Byrne was confronted by angry anti-suffrage colleagues who accused him of betraying his constituents and his political allies. The Red Rose supporters in the gallery shouted threats and insults, forcing police to escort Byrne from the chamber for his own protection. But he was also surrounded by Yellow Rose supporters who thanked him for his courage and promised political support for his future career. The transformation from anonymous legislator to historical figure occurred in minutes, and Byrne would spend the rest of his life explaining and defending his decision. Byrne's explanation for his vote became one of the most famous statements in American political history. Speaking to reporters that evening, he explained simply, "I know that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow,
and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification." This statement,
which became known as the Mother's Letter Defense, encapsulated the personal nature of political change and demonstrated how family relationships could affect public policy. Byrne's admission that he had voted for suffrage because his mother asked him to do so made him seem both more human and more courageous than if he had offered complicated political justifications. The ratification itself was not complete until the Senate confirmed the House vote the following day, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Senate vote was anticlimactic compared to the drama in the House, with ratification passing by a comfortable margin. The formal certification process took several days, as documents were prepared and signatures obtained, but the result was inevitable once the House had voted. Tennessee had become the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, and the long battle for women's suffrage was finally over. The national reaction to Tennessee's vote was overwhelming in both its scope and its emotional intensity. Newspapers across the country carried banner headlines announcing suffrage amendment ratified and "Women Win Vote After 70-Year Fight." The coverage was respectful and often affectionate, recognizing that the amendment represented the culmination of one of the largest and longest political movements in American history. Even publications that had opposed suffrage acknowledged the significance of the victory and promised to support women's political participation regardless of past disagreements. The suffrage leaders who had devoted their lives to the cause responded with gratitude and reflection rather than triumphal celebration. Carrie Chapman Catt, whose organized campaigning had provided the final push for ratification, spoke of the victory as belonging to the millions of women who had contributed to the movement over 7 decades. She specifically acknowledged the role of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and other early leaders whose work had made the final victory possible. The ratification was not just a political achievement, but a tribute to the persistence and dedication of generations of American women. The practical impact of the 19th Amendment was immediately apparent. Millions of women became eligible to vote for the first time in American history, fundamentally transforming the electorate. The 1920 presidential election saw women participating in large numbers, though not always as a unified voting bloc. The amendment also set a precedent for women's political participation that extended far beyond voting, opening doors to political office and public service that had previously been closed. The transformation of American politics that the suffrage movement had envisioned was finally underway. The long-term consequences of the 19th Amendment extended far beyond the immediate grant of voting rights. The amendment represented the first time that the federal Constitution had been used to expand rather than restrict the electorate, setting a precedent for later civil rights legislation. The 70-year campaign for women's suffrage had also developed organizational skills and political networks that would be invaluable to subsequent social movements. The techniques of petition gathering, lobbying, and public persuasion that had been perfected over decades became standard practice for later reform efforts. The victory in Tennessee also demonstrated how political change occurs through the accumulation of small action,
rather than dramatic gestures.
Phoebe Burns' letter was not extraordinary in itself. Thousands of similar letters were written to legislators that summer, but it arrived at the perfect moment and influenced a crucial vote. The ratification campaign succeeded not because of brilliant strategy or overwhelming force, but because of patient organizing that eventually created a majority. The lesson was that democratic change requires not just heroic leaders, but ordinary citizens willing to participate. In the tedious work of democracy, Harry Burns' vote also illustrated the unpredictable nature of political courage. Burns was not a suffrage leader, a radical reformer, or even a particularly courageous politician. He was a young legislator trying to balance competing pressures while remaining true to his own understanding of justice. His decision to vote for ratification was influenced by his mother's letter, but it was also based on his growing recognition that history was moving towards suffrage regardless of his personal preferences. His courage lay in being willing to acknowledge this reality and act on it despite political risks. The ratification of the 19th Amendment marked the end of one phase of the women's rights movement
and the beginning of another.
The vote had been achieved, but equality in other areas remained elusive. The organizations and networks built during the suffrage campaign would be invaluable to later efforts for legal equality, workplace rights, and social change. The 70-year struggle for the vote had demonstrated both the possibility of social change and the patience required to achieve it. The victory in Tennessee was not an ending but a beginning, launching American women into a new era of political participation and public responsibility. The story of Tennessee's ratification became part of American political folklore because it demonstrated how individual actions can affect the course of history. Phoebe Burns' letter changed her son's vote, which changed Tennessee's position, which changed the Constitution of the United States. This sequence of events, while unique in its specifics, illustrated the broader principle that democratic change occurs through the accumulation of individual choices made by ordinary citizens. The right that millions of American women exercised for the first time in 1920 was made possible by a mother's letter to her son and her son's willingness to follow her advice despite political consequences.